severed heads were arranged on the mantelpiece like grotesque trophies of a twisted collection. Some still had the faint traces of blood on their lips, remnants of the last kiss he'd given them. The most beautiful ones were kept for weeks stored in his private chamber, where he could return to admire their decomposing features. This was not the stuff of modern horror films, but the grim reality inside a French castle in the 1430s, where one of the wealthiest noblemen in history amassed the heads of children like an art collector hoarding masterpieces. Consider this. In the same period when modern-day serial killers would preserve body parts as chilling mementos, feeling an eerie urge to revisit their victims even after death, when the act of murder became dangerously tied to sexual desire, all of these dark patterns we associate with 20th century monsters were already playing out 5 centuries ago in medieval France. I hope everyone helps me with a like and a subscription, and don't forget to comment which country you are from. The connections are impossible to ignore. The grim trophy collection, the necrophilia, the eerie selection of victims based on beauty, the use of charm and gifts to lure the innocent, and even the macabre fascination with internal organs, the urge to open bodies and peer inside. But here's where it gets even more chilling. This man wasn't lurking in the shadows. He was a national hero, one of France's most celebrated war commanders, a Marshal of France who fought alongside Joan of Arc. He was the richest nobleman in the country, commanding armies, building chapels, living a life of unimaginable luxury. And for 8 years, while children disappeared from the villages near his castles, no one dared to touch him. What you are about to hear will shatter everything you thought you knew about medieval justice, about how power can shield the most vile of creatures, and about one of the most controversial executions in history. When Gilles de Rais finally stood on the scaffold in October 1440, he wasn't just another criminal facing his inevitable end. He was about to become the subject of a mystery that still perplexes historians to this day. Let's go back to where this horror began. Imagine the year is 1404 in northwestern France. A boy is born into wealth beyond imagination. His family controls vast lands, more than some entire kingdoms could ever dream of. Castles, each one adorned with the family's coat of arms, dot the countryside. This is Gilles de Montmorency-Laval, who would come to be known simply as Gilles de Rais, named for the land he would inherit. You'd think that such incredible privilege would ensure a charmed life. But tragedy struck early and cruelly. When Gilles was just 11 years old, he likely witnessed his father's brutal death in a hunting accident. It wasn't quick or merciful. His father, Gilles de Laval, was gored by a wild boar in a gruesome end that young Gilles may have witnessed firsthand. Shortly after his mother passed away, leaving him orphaned before he could even begin to grasp the power of a sword. The boy was left in the care of his maternal grandfather, Jean de Craon, and this is where the story turns dark. Jean had no interest in raising a nobleman to be educated or cultured. What he sought was power and wealth, and he viewed his grandson as nothing more than a pawn to further his own ambitions. During his trial years later, Gilles would place the blame for his twisted path squarely on his grandfather's shoulders, accusing him of neglecting his moral upbringing and allowing him to indulge every dark desire from childhood. But listen closely, because Jean de Craon was not the harmless old man one might expect. He was a ruthless manipulator, shaping his grandson into a cruel and violent individual. Jean taught Gilles early the brutal art of violence, not just military tactics or swordplay, though Gilles excelled at both. He taught him that power was a nobleman's right, that the weak were meant to serve the strong, and that wealth and influence made a man untouchable. By the time he was 16, Gilles was already showing the dual nature that would come to define his life. On one hand, he was brilliant, fluent in Latin, well-read and cultured. But lurking beneath that facade was a mind capable of horrors that no one could yet see. On the other hand, Gilles had a temper that could explode without warning. He was impulsive, hot-headed, prone to sudden acts of violence, traits that served him well in battle, but which would prove terrifying in his private chambers. The transformation from spoiled nobleman to military hero was rapid. At just 23, Gilles found himself in the service of the Dauphin, the future King Charles VII. France was losing the 100 Years' War, with vast swathes of territory under English control and morale at an all-time low. Then out of nowhere a miracle appeared, a teenage peasant girl claiming divine visions. This is where Gilles' story intertwines with one of history's most famous figures, Joan of Arc, or, as she called herself, Jeanne d'Arc, the Maid. When she arrived at court proclaiming that God had sent her to save France, most nobles laughed at her, dismissing her as a delusional child. But not Gilles. He was chosen as one of her military commanders tasked with keeping this strange charismatic girl alive in the brutal battles to come. Together they achieved the impossible. The siege of Orléans had dragged on for 6 months, the English forces seemingly unbreakable. Then Joan and Gilles arrived with their army. In just 4 days they shattered the siege. 4 days. What seasoned generals couldn't accomplish in half a year, a teenage girl and a young nobleman managed to do in less than a week. The victories kept rolling in. Town after town fell to their combined forces. Gilles proved himself fearless, always at the front, always charging into the thickest of the fighting. His valor earned him the highest military honor France could bestow, Marshal of France. At just 25, he was one of the youngest men ever to hold that title. But here's something that many people don't realize. While Gilles was winning glory on the battlefield, something was quietly changing inside him. The violence of medieval warfare was extreme. Cities were sacked, prisoners tortured, civilians slaughtered. Some historians believe that the constant exposure to brutality awakened something dark within Gilles, something that had been simmering ever since his unsupervised years under his grandfather's twisted influence. When Joan of Arc was captured by the English in 1430, Gilles did not try to rescue her. When she was burned at the stake in 1431, he didn't publicly mourn her. Instead, he retired to his estates, now one of the richest men in Europe. The war hero vanished and something else took his place. What happened next defies belief. Gilles threw himself into spending with a recklessness that shocked even the extravagant French nobility. He commissioned a play about the siege of Orléans, not just any play, but a grand spectacle with a cast of hundreds, free wine, food for all spectators. He maintained a personal guard of 200 men, all dressed in the finest clothes. He collected rare manuscripts, commissioned music, surrounded himself with beauty and art. But it was the chapel he built that truly raised eyebrows. In 1433, Gilles constructed the Chapel of the Holy Innocents, personally selecting a choir made up of young boys with beautiful voices. The irony of that name, the Holy Innocents, would not be revealed until his trial. This chapel, named for the children slaughtered by King Herod, was staffed by young boys chosen for their beauty. His spending spiraled out of control. Within a few years, this man, who could have bought entire kingdoms, was selling off his lands piece by piece to fund his extravagant lifestyle. His family watched in horror as castle after castle was sold to cover his debts. They even managed to get the king to issue an edict forbidding anyone from buying Gilles' property, hoping to stop him from destroying his inheritance. But Gilles found ways to bypass the rules. He always did. And here's where the story takes its darkest turn. While Gilles was publicly burning through his fortune, something monstrous was happening in secret. Whispers began to spread around 1432, just a year after Joan of Arc's death. Parents in villages surrounding Gilles' castles began to notice something strange. Children who went to beg at the castle gates were not coming back. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a coincidence. Noble households often took in young servants, and a boy might be recruited as a page and never return home. But as the number of missing children grew, the whispers turned into a chilling truth. And it wasn't just the poor children who vanished. A furrier's apprentice borrowed by Gilles' cousin disappeared. The son of a local merchant sent to deliver goods never returned. The pattern was always the same. A child would approach one of Gilles' castles like Mashakal Tifushamtos and be invited inside. They'd be told they would be given food, maybe offered work. Sometimes Gilles' servants would actively recruit them, promising them positions in the great lord's household. Once inside those stone walls, the children would simply vanish. Before I delve into what was truly happening behind those castle walls, trust me, it's worse than you can imagine. Hit subscribe if you want more dark history that they don't teach in schools. What comes next? Well, let's just say it's not for the faint of heart. But here's what makes this even more chilling. People knew. They knew. Witnesses would later testify that they had seen Gilles' servants disposing of small bodies. In 1437, locals watched as dozens of children's corpses were removed from one of his castles. But who was going to challenge the Marshal of France, who would accuse one of the country's most powerful men based on the word of the peasants? The disappearances only grew more frequent as Gilles' financial situation deteriorated. By the late 1430s, he was desperate. This was when he turned to alchemy and the occult, hoping to restore his fortune through supernatural means. He enlisted priests who claimed they could summon demons. A young Italian cleric named François Pleti became his close companion, promising to help him contact a demon called Baron, who could reveal the location of hidden treasure. The rituals Pleti performed demanded specific materials. The demon required the hand, heart, eyes, and blood of a young child. And just like that, the disappearances took on an even darker turn. These weren't just murders anymore, they were sacrifices. But let me paint a more vivid picture of what was happening inside those castle walls. Because when Gilles finally confessed in 1440, what he described horrified even his judges. These weren't quick, painless deaths. The children were hung from hooks in the ceiling until they lost consciousness. Then they were taken down, revived, and reassured that no harm would come to them. Gilles would comfort them, dry their tears, tell them it was just a game, and then the real horror would begin. The children would be stripped. Gilles and his accomplices servants like Henrich Rier and Etienne Corot would take turns. Sometimes they used a special sword, a brier, to slowly decapitate the victims while they were still alive. Other times they'd break their necks with sticks. Sometimes they'd simply slit their throats and watch them bleed out. But it was what happened after death that truly revealed the depths of Gilles's depravity. He would cut open their stomachs to admire their organs. He would kiss their dead lips. I can't even bring myself to describe all of it. His confession was so graphic that even medieval court records censored parts of it. The most beautiful heads, as I mentioned, he kept. He placed them on his mantelpiece and would visit them regularly, kissing them, talking to them, admiring their decomposing features. When the stench became unbearable, he'd have them burned and would search for new additions to his collection. How many children died in those castles, Gilles himself couldn't say. When asked during his trial, he confessed he had lost count. The court accused him of killing 40 children. Some estimates put the number as high as 200, even 800. The truth is, we'll never know. Many of the bodies were burned, others were dumped in rivers or buried in hidden locations. But here's the question that haunts historians. How did he get away with it for so long? 8 years of children disappearing, 8 years of murders, and it might have continued indefinitely if Gilles hadn't made one critical mistake. In May 1440, Gilles got into a dispute with a priest named Jean Leferrand over some property. The details don't matter, but what matters is that Gilles, in his typical impulsive fashion, decided to settle the dispute his way. He gathered his men, stormed the church where Leferrand was saying mass, and kidnapped him at sword point in front of witnesses. Now he'd gone too far. Attacking a priest, violating the sanctuary of a church, these were crimes even a marshal of France could not commit with impunity. The Bishop of Nantes finally had the excuse he needed to move against Gilles. But even then, they didn't arrest him for murder. The initial charges were for the assault on the priest and for heresy. The Duke of Brittany sent an armed force to arrest Gilles at his castle of Machecoul in September 1440. Here's what's remarkable. Gilles surrendered without a fight. This man, who commanded 200 soldiers and could have held out in his castle for months, simply handed over his sword. It was as if he was exhausted, ready for it all to end. The trial that followed was actually 2 trials running in parallel. A secular court prosecuted him for the assault on the priest and for murder, while an ecclesiastical court tried him for heresy and invoking demons. Both courts heard the same horrifying evidence. At first, Gilles was defiant, refusing to recognize the court's authority. He insulted the judges when they read out the charges, 49 articles detailing murders, sexual crimes, and demon summoning. Gilles denied everything, his arrogance still intact, but the court struck back hard. They excommunicated him. For a medieval nobleman, this was a fate worse than death. It meant eternal damnation. The weight of this threat broke him. On October 15th, just days before his execution, Gilles reversed his stance. He suddenly apologized to the judges, acknowledged their authority, and said he would confess. But even then he hesitated. He admitted to grievous crimes but denied any involvement with demons. Then, on October 20th, the prosecutor reminded him of the court's power to apply torture to extract the truth. The mere suggestion was enough to break him. Gilles agreed to make a full confession. What followed was one of the most detailed and horrifying admissions of guilt in legal history. Speaking through tears, Gilles confessed to everything: the murders, the sexual assaults, the dismemberments, the grotesque collection of heads. He described specific victims, detailed the methods of killing, and even spoke of the Italian priest Pleti and their demon-summoning rituals. He admitted to giving the demon children's body parts. But what makes his confession truly chilling was the clarity with which he spoke. There was no madness, no delusion. He was lucid, articulate, and precise in his descriptions. He knew exactly what he had done. And perhaps the most haunting part, he requested that his confession be published in French, not Latin, so that common people could read it as a warning to parents. His accomplices also confessed. Henrietta Rea and Etienne Corot, known as Pooh, described helping their master kill children. They spoke of disposing of bodies, cleaning up blood, and procuring new victims. Their testimonies aligned with Gilles in every crucial detail. The verdict was never in doubt. Both courts found him guilty. The ecclesiastical court convicted him of heresy and invoking demons. The secular court convicted him of the murder, sentencing him to death by hanging and burning. Even as he faced death, Gilles maintained a semblance of nobility. He asked for and received special privileges. He would be allowed to make a final confession and be reintegrated into the church before his execution. His body would be removed from the flames before it was completely consumed, allowing for a Christian burial. His servants would die alongside him, but their bodies would be burned to ash. October 26, 1440, the day of execution arrived. It was grey and cold. A scaffold was set up in a meadow outside Nantes, and huge crowds gathered: nobles, merchants, peasants. Many of them, parents of missing children, come to see justice done. Gilles arrived dressed in white, the colour of repentance. He addressed the crowd with apparent sincerity, asking for forgiveness for his crimes. He urged parents to raise their children, strictly blaming his own crimes on the laxness of his upbringing. He seemed genuinely remorseful by all accounts, his demeanour one of contrition. He requested to be executed first before his servants. The request was granted. As he stood on the scaffold, he turned to Henriette and Pooh and told them to die bravely, to think only of salvation. Then the noose was placed around Gilles's neck. The execution was swift. Gilles de Rais, Marshal of France, war hero and monstrous figure, died by hanging as the crowd stood in silent witness. His body was cut down and placed on a pyre, but it was removed before the flames could completely consume it. True to his final request, he was buried in the church of the monastery of Notre-Dame de Nantes. His servants followed next, their bodies left to burn completely, their ashes scattered to the wind. The crowd slowly dispersed, many weeping. Whether it was from relief, horror, or sympathy, the chronicles do not say. But here's where the story takes one final unsettling twist. In the centuries since that fateful October day, historians have begun to question, was Gilles de Rais actually guilty? Let's think about the evidence. No bodies were ever found in his castles during the investigation. The only physical evidence came from testimonies about events that happened years prior. His confession came only after the threat of torture and excommunication. And who benefited from his death? The Duke of Brittany, who prosecuted him, inherited all of Gilles's lands. The Bishop of Nantes gained significant political power. In 92, a French court even held a retrial for Gilles de Rais, examining all the evidence with modern eyes. They found him not guilty. They pointed to the financial motives of his accusers, the lack of physical evidence, and the fact that confessions extracted under torture were worthless. Some historians now argue that Gilles was the victim of a political conspiracy, that the charges were fabricated to seize his wealth and remove a powerful nobleman who had become too inconvenient. They note that charges of child murder and demon summoning were common accusations used against political enemies in medieval times, but others remain convinced of his guilt. They argue that the detailed confessions, the matching testimonies from multiple accomplices, and the widespread rumours all point to real crimes. Would multiple servants independently fabricate the same horrific details? Would hundreds of parents independently claim their children vanished at Gilles's castles? The truth is, we'll never know for certain. Medieval justice was brutal, unfair, and often corrupt. Torture could make anyone confess to anything. Powerful people routinely destroyed their enemies with false accusations, but sometimes, just sometimes, the guilty were actually guilty. What we do know is this: whether Gilles de Rais was a child-murdering monster or a victim of medieval injustice, his story reveals the dark heart of an era where power made you untouchable until it didn't, where children could vanish without investigation if they were poor enough, where the threat of torture was justice and confession under duress was truth. The execution of Gilles de Rais marked the end of one of history's most controversial figures: war hero or war criminal, patron of the arts or predatory monster, victim of conspiracy, or France's first serial killer. The questions remain unanswered, the truth buried with the children who vanished into the walls of his castles and never returned. But perhaps the real horror isn't whether Gilles was guilty. It's that in medieval France, someone could kill hundreds of children for 8 years before anyone in power cared enough to stop them. It's that poverty made you disposable. That noble birth made you untouchable. That justice didn't depend on truth, but on who had the most to gain from your death. When those flames rose around the scaffold that October day, they consumed more than just 3 men. They consumed evidence, truth, and perhaps hundreds of young lives whose stories we'll never know. The parents who gathered to watch had no doubts. They came for their children, for closure, for the sight of the monster who had stolen their babies, meeting his end. In the end, whether Gilles de Rais died a guilty man or an innocent one, his execution stands as a reminder. Power corrupts, wealth protects. And sometimes the monsters we fear most aren't hiding in the shadows. They're standing in the light-building chapels, commanding armies, and collecting the heads of children like works of art. The castle walls that once echoed with children's screams have long since crumbled. The chapels built by blood money have fallen into ruin, but the questions remain haunting. Historians and fascinating us still, because in Gilles de Rais we see not just a medieval monster but a mirror of our darkest capabilities. The war hero and the child killer, the patron of the arts and the collector of heads, the repentant sinner and the unrepentant predator, he was all of these. All of them died on that scaffold. And all of them remind us that the most terrifying monsters in history were human, all too human, hidden behind titles and wealth until the day justice or political convenience finally caught up with them. What do you think? Was Gilles de Rais guilty of these horrific crimes? Or was he framed by those who sought his wealth and power? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this dark chapter of history intrigued you, make sure you're subscribed. I've got an entire series uncovering the twisted tales your history teachers never told you about. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next investigation. Thank you everyone for watching the whole video. Please like and subscribe to watch more good videos.